Hello everyone, Max here from Evidence-Based Football Manager. Today we're going to talk about player recovery in FM24. This video is not part of the Matchday Mechanics series that I've been working on these past few months. The Matchday Mechanics series isn't finished yet. There are still a few more episodes to go in that series. But because I've been talking a lot about fitness-related parameters in my recent videos, like overall physical condition, match sharpness, and fatigue, people have been asking how those parameters recover on non-match days. So I decided to take a bit of a detour and do a video to address the topic of player recovery. Actually, I have dealt with the topic of player recovery on this channel before, back when I was doing videos for FM23. But I do feel that there are some questions that remain unanswered. And hey, FM24 is a new game, and you can't just assume that everything's the same between FM23 and FM24, which is why I've decided to tackle the topic of player recovery one more time in this video today. There are 5 different methods of player recovery in FM24. The first method is to simply empty out your training schedule and make your players go through some rest sessions. The second way is to make use of the recovery session, which is another type of training session that you can use in the game. The third way is to make your players rest for a few days, which exempts those players from training. You can use this third method by right-clicking on the player's name, going into the training menu, and here you can choose to rest your player for anywhere between 1 day to 2 weeks. I'm going to call this method the manual rest method so as to not confuse it with the rest training session, which is the first method of player recovery that I mentioned just now. The fourth method of recovery in the game is to send your players on a holiday, which exempts the player from all training and all matches while the player is away on a holiday. You can send a player on a holiday in the game by, again, right-clicking on the player's name, going into this training intensity part here, and you'll see the option to send the player on a holiday. The fifth and final method of player recovery in the game is to set your team's training intensity to the lowest level, which is called no pitch or gym work. Now, I do believe that the third method and the fifth method that I mentioned just now are essentially the same thing. For example, when I manually make this player here take a rest from training for a few days, you can see there's a yellow rest icon that appears next to the player's name. And here it also says that the player will be rested for 7 days. And if I go into the individual training setting for this player here and change his training intensity to no pitch or gym work for 7 days, the same thing will happen. So again, there's a yellow rest icon that appears next to the player's name. And here it also says the player will be rested for 7 days. So yeah, it seems that manually making your players rest for a few days is the same game mechanic as setting the training intensity of your team to the lowest level. So that means that there's basically 4 different ways of player recovery in FM24, using the rest training session, using the recovery training session, making the player rest for a few days, / setting the training intensity to the lowest level, and lastly, making the player go on a holiday. So I've conducted some experiments using these 4 different methods of player recovery in FM24 so that I could investigate how they all affect 3 different parameters in the game: overall physical condition, match sharpness, and fatigue. As always, I use my testcop save file to run these experiments. Since today I'm interested in testing what happens on non-match days, I skipped the testcop match to go to a day when no matches are being held for a few consecutive days. I set the player parameters at the start of the test to the following values. Overall physical condition was set to the lowest possible value of 50%, which allows me to observe how much OPC recovers as I progress the game for a few days. Match sharpness was set to the highest possible value of 100%, which allows me to observe how much match sharpness drops over a few days. And lastly, fatigue was set to 500, which allows me to observe how much fatigue drops over a few days. With fatigue, the maximum possible value is 1000, but due to how the fatigue mechanic works in the game, fatigue will actually very rarely go past 500, which is why I set the player's starting fatigue value as 500 for today's tests. Do refer to my previous video on the topic of fatigue game mechanics to find out why fatigue rarely goes past 500 in your actual Football Manager saves. The start of the test was on Sunday 0 hours, which is the midnight between Saturday and Sunday. I progressed the game for 3 days until Wednesday 0 hours, which is the midnight between Tuesday and Wednesday. I then recorded the amount of change in player OPC, match sharpness and fatigue during the 3-day period. I observed the changes of 2 players from the test cup save file, one player who is a striker and one player who is a central defender, and I calculated the average values of OPC, match sharpness and fatigue of those 2 players. I repeated the test 5 times every time I tested a different training scenario in order to build up a sample pool. I started by testing the following scenarios. 1. No training sessions were used for 3 days, which means that the training schedule was filled just with rest sessions for 3 straight days. 2. Recovery sessions were used for 3 straight days. 3. Different types of regular training sessions were used for 3 days. I didn't test every single type of training session in the game. I just didn't think it was necessary. I just chose 3 different training sessions in the game with varying degrees of intensity, which are outfield, overall, and physical sessions. According to the information that's displayed in the game, outfield training sessions are supposed to be relatively less intense, overall sessions are supposed to be kind of in between, and physical training sessions are supposed to be relatively more intense. So I thought these 3 types of training sessions would represent regular types of training sessions in FM24 with varying degrees of intensity. 4. I left the training schedule blank and then I manually made the players go on a rest for 3 days. 5. I left the training schedule blank and then sent the players on a holiday for 3 straight days. 6. I filled the training schedule with overall training session for 3 days and then I manually made the players rest for 3 days. 7. I filled the training schedule with overall training sessions for 3 days and then I sent the players on a holiday for 3 straight days. And let's take a look at the results. So this graph here shows you the amount of recovery that took place in the player's overall physical condition over the 3-day observation period. When rest sessions were used for 3 straight days, OPC of players recovered by around 29.3% over 3 days. When recovery sessions were used for 3 straight days, OPC of players recovered by around 21.3% over the same period. Whether 1 recovery session was used per day, 2 sessions were used per day, or 3 sessions were used per day, the amount of recovery was more or less similar. So this is a finding that is consistent with what I found in my past video on the topic of recovery. Back in FM23, I also found that the rest session was better than the recovery session when it came to the recovery of player OPC. And as you can see here, that result is replicated in FM24 as well. When outfield training sessions were used, OPC of players changed between 21.2% to 20.6% over 3 days, depending on the number of sessions that were used per day. When overall training session was used, OPC of players changed between 21.2% to 19.8% over 3 days, again depending on the number of sessions that were used per day. And when physical training sessions were used, OPC changed from 17.6% to 60.6% over 3 days. So with these 3 types of training sessions, the number of sessions that were used per day correlated with the amount of player recovery. So when 1 session was used per day, OPC recovered by the most amount, while 3 sessions per day led to the least amount of OPC recovery. And also the physical training session, which is supposed to be the most physically intense training session out of these 3 types of training sessions, resulted in the least amount of OPC recovery compared to outfield or overall sessions. So it seems that the recovery of OPC is dependent on both the number and the type of training sessions that are being used in your training schedule. When a blank training schedule was used and players were rested manually for 3 days, OPC recovered by 39% over 3 days. Remember at the start of the observation period, OPC of these players was set as 50%, which means that at the end of the 3-day observation period, OPC of these players almost went up to 90%, which is really good amount of recovery that can happen just within 3 days. Remember that manually resting your players has the same effect in the game as setting their training intensity to no pitch or gym work. So whether you rest your players manually or set their training intensity to no pitch or gym work, you can achieve equally good amounts of recovery in the player's OPC. When overall training was done for 3 days and players were manually rested during that period, OPC of those players recovered by 26.5%, which is higher than when players are doing overall training at the club, but not as high as when the training schedule was filled just with rest sessions. When a blank training schedule was used and players were sent on a holiday, the amount of recovery was around the same as just using a blank schedule without sending the players on a holiday. When overall training was used and players were sent on a holiday, the amount of recovery was about the same as doing overall training without the players going on a holiday. This is interesting because you would expect players to recover a lot faster when they're away on a holiday, but the amount of OPC recovery was about the same as not going on a holiday. You will see shortly that sending players on a holiday is more about speeding up the recovery of fatigue rather than speeding up the recovery of either OPC or match sharpness. I'll get to that later. But yeah, for now, just take note that sending players on a holiday doesn't speed up the recovery of their OPC. Alright, let's move on to this second graph here and talk about match sharpness. So this is a graph that shows you how match sharpness fell over the 3-day observation period for the players that are observed. Remember, match sharpness was set to 100% at the start of the observation period, so a smaller value on this bar graph means a smaller drop in match sharpness per day, which is favourable. You want match sharpness to drop as little as possible during non-match days, yeah? So first of all, when the training schedule was filled only with rest sessions, match sharpness fell on average by 3.8% over the 3-day observation period. When recovery sessions were used, match sharpness fell on average by 2.3% over 3 days. The number of recovery sessions that were used per day did not affect the amount of change in the player's match sharpness. This means that recovery is better than rest when it comes to helping players retain their match sharpness for a longer period during non-match days. When outfield, overall, or physical training sessions were used, match sharpness of players changed between 2.3% to 2.7% over the 3-day observation period, depending on the type and the number of training sessions that were used per day. It's interesting to note that more number of training sessions used per day resulted in greater amounts of match sharpness being lost, which I must say is rather counterintuitive. I would have thought that more amounts of training would help the players retain their match sharpness for a longer period of time on non-match days, but that doesn't seem to be the case according to the results that we're seeing right here, at least with these 3 types of training sessions that I tested. When rest sessions were used and players were rested manually, match sharpness dropped by 3.8% over 3 days, which is the same amount as the first test here, which is when rest sessions were used without resting the players. Remember folks, manually resting a player in this game is the same as setting their training intensity to the lowest level. When 3 overall training sessions were done for 3 days and players were rested manually, their match sharpness fell by 2.7% over 3 days, which is the same amount as this test here, which is when 3 overall training sessions were used without resting the players. When rest sessions were used and players were sent on a holiday, their match sharpness dropped by 3.8% over 3 days. When overall training sessions were used and players were sent on a holiday, their match sharpness dropped by 2.7% over 3 days. So based on these 4 results that you're seeing here, it appears that whether you manually rest your players or you set their training intensity to no pitch or gym work, or you send your players on a holiday, all those things have no effect on the amount of match sharpness that's lost on non-match days. It appears that there are 2 factors in the game that affect the amount of match sharpness that's lost on non-match days, and those 2 factors are the type of the training session that's used and also the number of training session that's used in your training schedule. So when it comes to helping your players retain their match sharpness as much as possible on non-match days, either using a recovery session or using just one training session per day resulted in the best performance out of all these scenarios that I tested. Now let's move on to this third graph here and talk about fatigue. Remember, I set fatigue of players as 500 at the start of the test, and this graph shows you the amount of fatigue that fell during the 3-day observation period. When rest sessions were used for 3 straight days, fatigue of these players fell by about 101 points. When recovery sessions were used, fatigue fell by between 51 to 48 points, which is about half of the amount of recovery that I got from using the rest sessions. So when it comes to the recovery of fatigue, rest sessions are better than recovery sessions. When outfield, overall, or physical training sessions were used, fatigue recovered by between 48 to 39%, depending on the type and the number of training sessions that were used per day. Less number of training sessions resulted in greater amounts of fatigue recovery, while more number of sessions led to less amounts of recovery. Also, the physical training session, which is supposed to be the most physically intense training session out of the 3 training sessions that I've got here, resulted in the least amount of fatigue recovery. So just like OPC and match sharpness, the amount of fatigue recovery is affected by both the number and the type of training session that's used in your training schedule on non-match days. When rest sessions were used and players were rested manually, the amount of fatigue recovery of those players was a lot higher. So here you can see that fatigue recovered on average by around 137 points over the 3-day observation period, which is a lot higher than all these previous scenarios that I told you about just now. When overall training sessions were used and players were rested manually, their fatigue recovered by about 57 points over the 3-day observation period, which is a little bit better than using overall training sessions without resting your players. When rest sessions were used and players were sent on a holiday, their fatigue recovered by 152.4 points, which is the largest amount of recovery out of all these scenarios that I tested. When overall sessions were used and players were sent on a holiday, the amount of recovery wasn't as high as this previous scenario, but it was still a lot higher than using overall training sessions without sending the player on a holiday. So this is where the holiday game mechanic becomes useful in FM24. Sending players on a holiday doesn't have any impact on the recovery of OPC and match sharpness, which is something I showed you in the previous 2 graphs, but it does speed up the recovery of fatigue of your players. So just to reiterate, when it comes to the recovery of fatigue, rest sessions are better than recovery sessions. But if you really feel the need to supercharge all of your players in a short period of time, one trick you can use is to empty out your training schedule so that the training schedule is filled just with rest sessions. And on top of that, send all of your players on a holiday for a few days. And that will make your players recover their fatigue by a very large amount in a relatively short period of time. All right, let's move on to the next experiment and talk about training intensity. As mentioned earlier, there are 4 levels of training intensity in Football Manager. They are called no pitch or gym work, half intensity, normal intensity, and double intensity. In the experiments that I showed you earlier, training intensity was fixed as normal intensity across all levels of OPC because I wanted training intensity to be consistent across all levels of OPC in all of those tests. This time, I tried changing training intensity to either the lowest level, which is called no pitch or gym work, or the highest level, which is called double intensity, across all OPC levels, so that I could observe the changes in player OPC, match sharpness, and fatigue. Okay, let's take a look at the results. So this is a graph here that shows you the amount of OPC recovery over the 3-day observation period as I changed the training intensity of the players to various levels. And you can see that there's a recurring pattern across all these different types of training schedules. When training intensity was set to the lowest level, no pitch or gym work, OPC of these players recovered by the most amount, regardless of the type of training schedule that was used. On the other hand, when training intensity was set as either normal or double intensity, there were negligible differences in the amount of recovery for all these scenarios. And next, let's take a look at match sharpness. So So this is a graph that shows you the amount of match sharpness that was lost over the 3-day observation period as I changed the training intensity of the players to different levels. Again, there is a recurring pattern here across the various types of training schedules that I tested. No pitch or gym work led to the most amounts of match sharpness being lost over the 3-day observation period, whereas double training intensity led to the least amount of match sharpness being lost over the 3-day period. Although the differences are pretty minor between the 3 levels of training intensity. For example, if you take a look at the physical training session here, when training intensity was set as no pitch or gym work, match sharpness of players fell by 2.7% over the 3-day period, whereas when training intensity was set as double intensity, match sharpness of players fell by 2.6% over the 3-day period. So while the level of training intensity did lead to a difference in the amount of match sharpness that was lost during the observation period, the amount of difference was relatively minor between the different levels of training intensity. And lastly, let's take a look at fatigue. So this is a graph here that shows you the amount of player fatigue that recovered over the 3-day observation period. So for all these different types of training schedules that I tested, no pitch or gym work resulted in the most amounts of fatigue recovery. It's interesting that double training intensity resulted in greater amounts of recovery compared to normal training intensity. For example, if you take a look at the outfield training session, when training intensity was set as no pitch or gym work, fatigue recovered by 51.1 points over 3 days. When training intensity was set as normal, fatigue recovered by 44.6 points. And when training intensity was set as double intensity, fatigue recovered by 48.4 points. So when it comes to the recovery of fatigue, no pitch or gym work is the best, double training intensity is the second best, and normal training intensity is the worst. This is a little bit strange because I would have thought that double intensity training would lead to the worst fatigue recovery out of the 3 levels of training intensity that I tested. But yeah, for some reason, that doesn't seem to be the case according to the results that you're seeing here. Alright folks, time to make a summary of today's findings. 1. When it comes to the recovery of OPC and the recovery of fatigue, the rest session is better than the recovery session. 2. Recovery of OPC and the recovery of fatigue are both affected by the type of training session that's used. Although I haven't tested every single type of training session in FM24, it does appear that training sessions that are supposed to be more physically intense do lead to less amounts of OPC and fatigue recovery. 3. Recovery of OPC and recovery of fatigue are both affected by the number of training sessions that's used per day. 1 training session per day leads to the most amount of recovery, while 3 sessions per day leads to the least amount of recovery. 4. When it comes to the retention of match sharpness on non-match days, recovery session is better than the rest session. 5. More number of training session that's used per day leads to slightly higher amounts of match sharpness that is lost on non-match days. 6. When you manually rest your players, which is the same game mechanic as setting their training intensity to no pitch or gym work, the amount of OPC and fatigue recovery will both go up. Manually resting a player has no impact on the amount of match sharpness that is lost on non-match days. 7. When you send your players on a holiday, the amount of fatigue recovery goes up. Sending a player on a holiday has no impact on the recovery of OPC or the amount of match sharpness that is lost on non-match days. 8. Out of the different levels of training intensity, no pitch or gym work leads to the most amounts of OPC recovery. Normal training intensity and double training intensity did not lead to any differences in the recovery of OPC. 9. Out of the different levels of training intensity, double intensity led to the least amounts of match sharpness being lost on non-match days, followed by normal intensity, followed by no pitch or gym work. 10. Out of the different levels of training intensity, no pitch or gym work led to the most amounts of fatigue recovery, followed by double intensity, followed by normal intensity. Alright folks, that's it for today's video. As always, if you have any questions or feedbacks, please leave them in the comment section below and I will take a look at them. I will be continuing with the match day mechanics series in my next video. Right, cheers guys, thanks for watching. Bye.